Welcome in to the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And hey, we got a great show lined up for you guys. We got Stephen Lassan, Athlon Sports. Going to talk every single SEC team. Did not skip any this time, not even the teams on the bye week. So a really great long conversation with Stephen in just a moment. But a lot of injury news to start the show. Some key injuries heading into a big weekend in the SEC. So let's not delay any further. And let's start with Nick Saban. Latest thoughts on Bryce Young. Of course, the reigning Heisman Trophy winner, status unknown heading into this Tennessee game. And all last week it was cloak and daggers whether he'd play, wouldn't he? Now a lot of media, Chris Lowe, Greg McElroy, they're all sharing that they hear that Bryce Young is going to play against Tennessee. What's Nick Saban say? Not a whole hell of a lot, to be honest with you, but here's the latest on what the Alabama coach had to say about his star quarterback.
What's the latest on Bryce Young's status?
Bryce is getting reevaluated today. I don't really know much. I hadn't talked to Doc, since he did that. Hopefully we're going to try to get him ready to play this week, but this is something that nobody can predict how quickly this is going to give him an opportunity to be able to go out and do what he needs to do, and we'll see as the week progresses, but I don't have an update much more than that.
Don't have much of an update. Sure, Nick, we believe you on that one, but it's going to be interesting to see if Bryce does suit up for this game, as is kind of expected at this point. How effective is he going to be? Can he push the ball down the field with that banged up shoulder? That's going to be critical. It's very easy to look at this and say, oh, they're getting him back. They're going to run away with it. What if he's in there and he's 80% of what he normally is and he makes some critical mistakes? It may even suit Alabama not to play him if he's not at 100%. So, hey, they're going to have to make that determination this week in Tuscaloosa, but can't wait for that matchup. Going to go on a deep dive with Stephen on Tennessee, Alabama. And speaking of Tennessee, let's kick it over to Josh Heupel real quick. Gave the latest update on Cedric Tillman. And as always, Coach Hype, he keeps things pretty close to the vest.
A couple of quick things, Josh. First off, the daily Cedric Tillman question. How is he doing, and how's all that?
I was wondering if that was going to be the second question or how deep we'd get in. Cedric's doing good. This is part of the reason why he had the surgery is to try to be back for this one. He's continuing to progress over the weekend, and so we'll monitor him. And at the end of the day, our medical team, like I said last week, our medical team and Cedric will make the right decision for him now and in the future too.
So we got a game of dueling say-nothing coaches here. Cedric Tillman, will he or won't he play? Wouldn't be a surprise if he does take the field. Again, just the same as Bryce Young. How effective will he be? Certainly, you don't want to say Tennessee doesn't even need him. The way Brew McCoy and Jalen Hyatt are playing, they're looking like the best duo of receivers in the SEC right now. So anything you can get from Cedric Tillman in this matchup, just gravy at this point in time. But, of course, this is the toughest defense Tennessee will have faced yet. Arguably the best defense in the country. Can't wait, again, to watch this football game. But let's kick it down real quick to Kirby, who kind of revealed that Stetson Bennett been a little banged up. Maybe that's why, as Stephen will get to in here in just a second, each of the last 3 games, yards per attempt going down each of the last 3 weeks there for the Georgia quarterback going up against the likes of Kent State, Missouri, and Auburn. Not a great sign, but it makes a hell of a lot more sense if he's injured, as Kirby indicates he has been dealing with some stuff, but sure as heck hasn't stopped him from playing and running all over them Auburn Tigers.
Kirby, I know you guys meet with the broadcast crew before the game. I noticed then when getting to watch the game again that they mentioned something about Stetson and a shoulder issue. I wanted to see if what he's dealing with there, how limiting that is for him, for you guys, week of practice, game plan. Is there anything going on there?
No, Stetson's been good. He was dinged up after the Missouri game in terms of he took some shots in that game. I think he got knocked down a couple times. His shoulder was bothering him, but it hadn't been a large limitation. I mean, he hadn't missed practice time and things. So he's been good in regards to that.
Kirby, what does Stetson's running ability bring to your offense that maybe some of your other starting quarterbacks didn't have, and beyond just the long touchdown the other day?
He brings the ability to make defenses play him honest. You can't play a guy that can take off running a certain way, and if you do, he'll expose you. So he gives you the ability when people man match, play split safety coverages. He can do things with his feet. Third down, he becomes a weapon. Boot and nakeds, read plays where you can read the backer and read the flow, and you're actually defending one extra person. And we know that defensively from some of the quarterbacks we've had to face, the nightmare that can create. So we got to do a good job of utilizing that skill set while also keeping him safe.
So after hearing that, it kind of does make a lot more sense why Stetson, his performance a little bit dropped off. Still, I believe he's only got 5 passing touchdowns on the season. So there's something to monitor heading into this Vanderbilt game. How much run does he get? To be honest with you, they don't even need Stetson in this matchup. So will he play in the second half? Seems kind of doubtful based on Kirby's comments right there. Now another banged-up quarterback, desperate to get back on the field to help his team. KJ Jefferson, Sam Pittman indicated should be good to go as far as he knows at this point in time. KJ Jefferson did practice, full participant on Monday, and he revealed Malik Hornsby, now officially the number 2. Pretty interesting comments here on Malik Hornsby. Let's kick it over to Sam Pittman, talks KJ and Malik.
With the quarterback situation, obviously you mentioned expecting to get KJ back. But given the way the game played out and everything, is Hornsby the backup quarterback now?
Yeah, I talked to Malik again. I kind of had a Monday meeting with him last week and won, and he certainly earned that spot on Saturday. And I just gave him his choice, whether he wanted to stay where he was as a 2 quarterback now, or whether he wanted to move to wide out, or whether he was interested in moving to corner. Obviously the team needs some defensive back help, and he'll have to explain, more than I can with him. But there was a big weight lifted off his back, I think, with the way that he performed. I think he validated what he thought about himself as a quarterback and what the team did, and he wants to stay right there, be ready if needed at quarterback, and not necessarily do the wide receiver, quarterback, all that stuff. Just be ready when needed as a number 2 quarterback.
So if you caught that there, hell, they considered moving Hornsby to corner. Oh my God, that is kind of interesting, but he was by far the best option with KJ out of the lineup for Arkansas, so I think you got to leave him at quarterback given that KJ's been kind of banged up this year, and maybe we give Hornsby some run too. He's very, very, very dynamic with his legs. He's got the big play ability with his arm, so hopefully KJ Jefferson back on the field, back to his old self this Saturday against BYU. As Pittman indicated there, it looks like that's going to happen. A final injury update here from a head coach, Mark Stoops. Latest on Will Levis. He didn't give us much before the South Carolina game, not giving us a ton after it.
Yes.
Or is it still a day-to-day approach with Will this week?
It is.
Ooh, they're going to need him from Mississippi State. Will Rogers and company, they're going to put up some points on Kentucky. I know Kentucky's got a great defense, but, 20, 24 points, that may not cut it against Mike Leach and company coming to Lexington Saturday, big-time matchup. And then one final one here. Lane Kiffin didn't comment, so we're not going to kick it over to him. He wouldn't reveal anything, but old On 3 Sports is reporting that Michael Trigg, star tight end for the Ole Miss Rebels, likely out for the season due to injury. Again, Lane Kiffin would not confirm nor deny that statement. Just says we don't give out health information, even though they give out health information basically every press conference. So that kind of leads me to believe that Trigg is going to be out for a little while. But more gamesmanship there in Oxford from old Lane Kiffin. But hey, enough of me talking. Great conversation here with Stephen Lassan. Went a little long on this one, so let's just kick right over to it. We're talking an hour plus with the college football encyclopedia himself, Stephen Lassan. All right, we're pleased to once again be joined by the man himself, Stephen Lassan, Athlon Sports weekly segment. Give him a follow at Athlon Stephen, and don't forget to check out his YouTube channel, All CFB 365. Stephen, how you doing, my friend?
Hey, Mike, I'm doing great. It's good to be back here. I heard there was a big game coming up this week and also some other good action around the SEC. But hey, good to be with you and good to be breaking it all down.
Yeah, no doubt, Stephen. As a Tennessee alum, it's great that College Game Day. I mean, 2 and 3 weeks, 2 and 4 weeks here, coming to Rocky Top, SEC Nation. To me, it's the game of the year up to this point. So cannot wait to get into that. We'll do a deep dive on that one. But I really wanted to ask you this, Stephen, because whenever there's a coaching change in college, I know it throws a big old wrench into your workload. We didn't have any coaches fired this week at the college level, but we did have one in the NFL that has ties to the college game, and that is, of course, Carolina Panthers head coach Matt Rhule. Just wanted to get your thoughts on what you know after watching him at Baylor and Temple and the job he did rebuilding those programs to get him that Carolina Panthers job. And if you think there's any chance we see him in the SEC at some point soon, what's your read on that?
Yeah, I think if I'm an SEC job, namely Auburn, or if any other ones open up this offseason, he would be near the top of my list. I think you go back to what he did at Baylor, and before he got to Baylor, he had a successful run at Temple, and then he went to Baylor after that. They only won 1 game in his first year, but you saw progress in year 2. I think they won 7 games. Then third year, they played for the Big 12 championship. So they made considerable progress over 3 years. And one of the things that they really specialized in was talent development, going out and recruiting kind of a specific look that they were looking for in terms of, speed and athleticism and metrics, going out and getting those players, developing them. And you saw what they were able to do by his 3rd season. And even after that, they've been able to build on that. So he didn't take over Baylor in great shape and did a good job after that. So I think he would be a good fit at a number of college jobs. The only question I think is, he doesn't really have SEC experience. He's played at Penn State. He spent a lot of time in the East Coast, and of course he coached at Temple and Baylor. So he doesn't have SEC experience. But there is one thing that I think is kind of underrated in all this. He's available right now. And that's so important in this era of college football where the transfer portal and recruiting, you could hire him basically by November 10th or so, and he can already start working on things for next year. So I think that is something to watch as we go forward. If Auburn and others try to make coaching moves, his availability is a big plus.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously there's not a lot of coaches on the hot seat in the SEC aside from Brian Harsin. So we may have to have you back on to touch more on that job in the weeks to come. But hey, we'll save that conversation for a different day, Stephen. But, before we get into some of these big time matchups in the SEC, I wanted to throw this your way, Stephen, because right now, as you referenced, I mean, Tennessee fans are on cloud 9, undefeated, got Alabama coming in, have not beaten them in I guess technically 16 years. I believe the streak is 15 years in a row you've lost to Nick Saban. But how does, Tennessee, so much momentum right now in that offense with the quarterback, Josh Heupel, calling plays for Hendon Hooker. I mean, you can make the case that they could beat anybody in college football on any given day. So not necessarily power rankings, because we've kind of done that before, but maybe which program do you trust more that's undefeated in the SEC? Tennessee, Alabama, given uncertainty there with Bryce Young, or Georgia, which according to Kirby Smart now, Stetson Bennett's a little banged up. They're missing some key playmakers. So maybe your answer maybe changes in a month, but hey, this game's on Saturday, Stephen. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts. Which of those three undefeated SEC programs do you trust more right now?
I think if this is a bad take, be sure to go back a month from now and put that Aaron Judge update in there from ESPN so they don't have to listen to I think, my answer probably would be Alabama, just because they've been there, they've done that. I think they're going to get Bryce Young back this week, not to mention I think they've got the best defense in college football. I think to your point, all three of these teams, I've started to think about, national kind of rankings, and I think Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State are your top three in some order. But I also think that they are a little bit ahead of everyone else. But I think Tennessee is in that second tier. I think the caveat is I think all three of those teams at the top are vulnerable. I think Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State can all be beaten. I think on a neutral field, I think I would take Alabama over pretty much everybody in college football right now with a healthy Bryce Young. But could Tennessee beat Alabama this week? Absolutely. Could they beat Georgia? Yeah, I think all those teams are just better at the top, but they're also not good enough to the point where they can just pencil in every game as a victory. So I think I would feel the best about Alabama just because the combination of Bryce Young plus that defense, assuming he's 100%, that would be the team I probably trust the most going forward.
And how about this, Stephen? A little curveball for you. So you trust Alabama the most, but based on what you just said there, they're not unflappable, I guess is the right word. I mean, they can be beaten, which is, I think, good for college football because you just never know what you're going to get any given Sunday. Heck, Texas A&M almost beat them in Tuscaloosa. So looking ahead quickly at Alabama's upcoming schedule, at Tennessee, not too long, they got to go at LSU, which, maybe they're about to kind of careen a little bit as the schedule gets tougher, or maybe they get better and better. And they also got at Ole Miss, which is also undefeated. If you could put a percentage on the likelihood that Alabama is undefeated after those three road games, just ballpark, what do you think that answer would be?
Man, that's a great question because my answer to all projections is always I think every team loses a game. It's just the average. I mean, Alabama almost lost at Texas in a second week of the season. So I would probably guess if I had to put a percentage on it, I think it's probably I would 70-30 that they maybe finish undefeated. I think when you look at that schedule, I think LSU certainly, depending on which LSU team shows up, maybe they get a game. It could be one-sided. Ole Miss later in the year, I mean, Lane Kiffin would love nothing more than to give Nick Saban his first loss of the season. So it's not crazy to think that both of the, two SEC teams make the playoff with one loss. I know I'm sort of, hedging a little bit here, but I think the story of the season for me coming into it was Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State are just better than everyone. And I don't know that we can necessarily say that they're as dominant as we thought. I think they're all more vulnerable from Saturday to Saturday. They've shown enough flaws to where these teams in the second tier, like Tennessee, like an Ole Miss, can beat them on a Saturday.
Now, I don't know about you, Stephen, but personally, I think I kind of put Ole Miss, who just now their tight end apparently out for the season, Michael Trigg, that was reported on Monday. I think they're on a slightly lower tier than Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. Curious to get your thoughts. But right there, Mississippi State, I think, is basically on par with Ole Miss. I realize Mississippi State's already dropped a game, but where would you rank those two? And I realize the game is in Oxford, so I'm not asking you to predict that game, Stephen. But if Mississippi State and Ole Miss met this upcoming Saturday on a neutral field, who would you take in that ball game? Are they on the same tier, or do you have Ole Miss higher than Mississippi State?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to go back to the last question for a second, I think I said Tennessee and Ole Miss are kind of in that tier too. I think Tennessee's a step ahead of Ole Miss. I think they're sort of like the middle of college football this year is just kind of all just clustered really close together. And some of that's transfers, older rosters, the amount of coaching changes we had last year. So I don't know if there's necessarily a wide gap, like once you get into that middle, but I think Tennessee has separated itself from Ole Miss to where they're in that second tier. Ole Miss is probably in the next tier with Mississippi State. I've got Ole Miss right there on the verge of being a top 10 team this year. I think if Mississippi State had beaten LSU, I think they would almost be back to back in the rankings. So if they played tomorrow, I would probably pick Ole Miss just because Lane Kiffin's 2-0 against Mississippi State. But the funny thing is, you think about these teams like statistically in SEC play so far, they're pretty similar on defense. We know they can both score. I think Ole Miss probably has a little bit more upside to gain on offense. You mentioned the Michael Trigg injury, but I think if they can continue to get Jackson Dart comfortable, I like the upside. But I also think on the flip side of things, I think you know what you're going to get out of Mississippi State every week. I mean, they had one off performance against LSU, and that was the one game that they lost. But if the offensive line plays like that, I mean, you're pretty much going to have to score 30 or so to try to beat them every week, and that's not going to be easy.
All right, Stephen. So looking ahead to the upcoming games on the SEC slate, we do have one non-conference matchup, an interesting one, Arkansas on the road at BYU. BYU just lost to Notre Dame. What can you tell the audience about BYU and how difficult of a challenge this is going to be for the Arkansas Razorbacks?
Yeah, BYU has won its last 5 games against Power 5 opponents in Provo. And they're sort of in a weird spot because they're not a Group of 5 team, but they're not a Power 5 team yet. They're going to the Big 12 next season. So I wouldn't let the independent designation fool you. Like, this is a really good team. I think they're probably comparable to Cincinnati in terms of team strength. BYU was in the top 25. At least I had them ranked last week before they lost to Notre Dame. I think if you're Arkansas, I think there's one area that I think they can take advantage of. Offensively, BYU is very good at pass blocking. It's a veteran offensive line that's very good. Jaron Hall, you'll probably hear more about him as far as NFL draft purposes later on down the road. He's had 2 really nice years at quarterback replacing Zach Wilson, and he is a little bit banged up. He didn't play great against Notre Dame. I think there's a little bit of concern about how much at full strength he will be. They've been banged up at receiver. But if he's healthy, the matchup of BYU's passing game against Arkansas secondary is obviously a big concern. But if you're Arkansas, I think you can run on this defense. 3 out of the last 4 opponents BYU faced rushed for basically 200 yards or more. So if you're Arkansas, Rocket Sanders, a healthy KJ Jefferson, keeping the ball away from BYU's offense. This is not an easy place to play, but I do think that there are some matchups that Arkansas can take advantage of.
So just reading between the lines of what you just said there, you think it could be a high scoring game that the team with the fewest turnovers comes away and wins, or first team to 30? Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I do. I mean, BYU's giving up about 26 points a game on defense this year. They also played old SEC friend Bo Nix at Oregon a few weeks ago and gave up over 40 points. And so, teams that can hurt them on the ground and also hurt them through the air at the same time. When they played Baylor just didn't have the passing game going. They could hurt teams on the ground. They just didn't have the balance. And so Oregon gave them trouble. Notre Dame gave them trouble. So I think if I'm Arkansas, this is kind of one of those classic line of scrimmage games. You want to get Jefferson and Sanders going. The more you can probably keep it away from Jaron Hall and those receivers is probably a good thing. So I think to your point, fairly high scoring, like, maybe Arkansas getting into the 30s would be enough to potentially win this one.
Now, Arkansas coming off some tough losses, A&M, Alabama just steamrolled them, Mississippi State beat them pretty handily there in Starkville. Are you hitting the panic button with Arkansas, or are you sitting here looking at it like, yeah, you probably should have beat A&M, but the other two, again, we just talked up Alabama. You got more confidence in them than anybody in the country. You Mississippi State, borderline, top 15, top 10 team, on the road. I mean, looking at Arkansas, the rest of their schedule, I'm not saying they're going to win out because they're so banged up. Even that seems unlikely, but they're probably going to be favored in nearly every game they play. Do you think Arkansas can still salvage this and have a quality season?
I do. I think that's what stands out to me is when I look at their schedule, if they can win this week, their next 5 games the rest of the way, a home game against Ole Miss and LSU, and who knows what's going to happen with Auburn by that point. Also, old SEC friend Hugh Freeze and Liberty on the schedule, and then there's the road trip to Missouri. Like you look at the schedule and you go, yeah, there are some games in there that make you nervous, but none of those are Alabama. There's all these games are very winnable too. I go back to something we talked about last week. I mean, Arkansas has played a really difficult stretch of games. A&M, Alabama, Mississippi State, now to BYU. Just getting the bye week, I think, and getting healthy and getting some guys back and back to 100%, I think can make a difference for this Arkansas team. They certainly have flaws, and we've seen them this year. But based upon that schedule, if they put some things together, I think they can still have a really quality season, assuming they can win this Saturday and get some guys back down the stretch.
Right. And again, I realize this is not the season fans of hope, but I legitimately, Stephen, I'm not making this up. I've heard from Arkansas fans, Sam Pittman on the hot seat, Barry Odom, we got to get rid of his ass, Kendall Browse. They've always hated Kendall Browse for some reason.
These guys didn't forget how to coach one off season.
Would you even consider getting rid of any of those guys?
No, not at all. I mean, I think, I always say this, like when it comes to like games and things, it's never as bad and it's never as good as it looks. And the hardest thing in college football is we get 12 data points after waiting all freaking summer to see these teams play. And so you have a couple like weird moments and you're all of a sudden, you're hitting the panic button. I think we have to wait to the end of the season and then evaluate. Like if Arkansas really at the end of the year is sitting there at 5-7 or 6-6, I'd be worried. But I don't think that Odom and Bryles, they're one of the better coordinator pairings in the SEC. Pittman's done a good job of recruiting the portal. They'll do it again this offseason. I'm sure Arkansas is going to be fine in the long haul. But you can, if that's a bad take later on, we can revisit that. But I feel okay about Arkansas long term.
All right, how about this one, Stephen? I mean, I don't know how in the world you handicap this one, so I'm leaving that up to you. LSU on the road at Florida, the Billy Napier Bowl. LSU famously didn't even consider the guy, even though he was dominating at a lower level. I get it, in your own state, going up against Brian Kelly. I mean, this is one of the best rivalries in the SEC. What's your read on the game?
I got no idea, man. I mean, I don't know what LSU or Florida team we're going to get on a week-to-week basis. I mean, Florida's been really hard to figure out. They play close games. That's what Napier did at Louisiana. They played a lot of close games. Sometimes they played down to teams. They would play up to teams. I'm not surprised we're seeing that now. LSU, I think the offensive line is just such a big concern. No Campbell. Dellinger got banged up. Jaden Daniels was sacked 5 times. No real running game against Tennessee. So I think there's a lot of mystery here. If you look at the series, I mean, the last 7 or 8 of these have been really close. And not to mention, I think LSU's had pretty good success. I think they're 4-2 in their last 6 against Florida. So I think the only thing we can expect is it's much like LSU Auburn. It's probably going to be close. There's probably going to be some crazy stuff that happens. It'll probably be entertaining to watch. If you ask me to pick, I would probably lean Florida just because they're at home. They have Anthony Richardson. If he bounces back this week, and then, of course, I think LSU's injuries on the offensive line might be a little bit much in Gainesville.
Right, but it's almost impossible to gamble on Anthony Richardson, Stephen. I mean, one week he's amazing. The next, it's like he's in a different body or something. I stopped gambling on Florida for that very reason, because you just don't know which version of him is going to show up. But let me ask you this. Mike Denbrock, already hearing rumblings that he's not doing a great job for LSU. Maybe very, very difficult to even evaluate him, given that they reshuffled the offensive line by necessity, not by some desire to do that down there in Baton Rouge. But what's your early thoughts on how they're utilizing their talent down there? Because that's a tough team to peg too. I think Jaden Daniels is doing as good a job as you can expect, given that offensive line. But a lot, all these LSU fans thought we got the best receiving core in the SEC coming into the season, and Malik Neighbors is doing well. But beyond that, I mean, Kayshon Boutte, I mean, he's like a non-factor. He scored his first touchdown of the season last week. Do you think they're doing a good job managing that offensive talent in Baton Rouge?
I think it's really hard to kind of give you a good answer on this just because I think the offensive line is just so much of a struggle week to week. And it's been hard for LSU to get any continuity on their front because, they get the freshmen in there, they start playing well. Now one is out against Tennessee. Now they have another guy who's banged up. They've juggled that lineup, and it was already a group that had questions coming into this year. So it's really hard to fix a broken offensive line during the year. And it's just one of those things you can either recruit your way out of it or develop. And it's just going to have to be some sort of combination of both. I think Jaden Daniels is probably their best bet at this point, just because he can run around and make some plays. Now, I think we saw some frustration with Brian Kelly in the passing game on Saturday with the one-on-one matchups and, wanting Jaden Daniels maybe to be a little bit more aggressive. So I think there's maybe a little bit more kind of meat on the bone for LSU's offense. Like they can take some advantage of some of those guys they have in the passing game, but really it all comes down to the offensive line. If you can't protect, I mean, in the SEC West, when you got to play, A&M and Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Alabama, and Everton and Florida coming up this week, it's just really hard to win without a functional line. So I think in Denbrock's case, I want to see what happens when they get some more pieces around him. And also too, I think going forward, Walker Howard, next year at some point or somebody else at quarterback. It's a bad answer, but I think if you're LSU, I trust Brian Kelly to figure this out. It just may not be this year that they have all the pieces in place on offense.
Any pressure, you think, on Brian Kelly to win this game? I'm certainly, as crazy as we are in the SEC, Stephen, no one's going to be calling for the man's job after 7 games or anything. But
I don't know. I saw some message board post after the first game against Florida State.
That was just such a poor showing against Tennessee. He clearly got out-coached. And just the fact that I can't, still for the life of me, Stephen, I've asked people down there, what was the deal with them and Billy Napier? And I mean, didn't even consider the guy. If he whoops you, I mean, I feel like some LSU people, they're not going to be completely out on Kelly or anything, but I think there's going to be some serious questions of what in the world we're doing here. Now, he turns around and beats Nick Saban, they'll give him a contract extension. So I know how this works, but any added pressure you think on Kelly to get this win?
It's a good question. Like, I don't know if it's necessarily like hot seat pressure as much as it just might be like internal pressure on the coaching staff. Like they just really want to win this one. And I think Billy Napier probably really wants to beat LSU considering the coaching search. But I think, for LSU coming into this year, I sort of gauge teams based upon, preseason expectations and also kind of like the Vegas over-unders. And you're looking at a team that was like 6-7 wins, depending on where you looked. I think we've seen some development, and I think that this team will get better over the course of the season, especially if they can figure out some things on the offensive line. But really, I think for Brian Kelly, at the end of the year, if they're sitting there at 7-5, 8-4, I think that's a pretty good season. Now, if they're sitting there at 7-5, all of a sudden we get into next year, there's a big red flag right there. So I don't necessarily think it's like hot seat pressure. I think there's probably a lot of pressure on the coaching staff just to say, we know what happened in that search. We really want this game. Same thing for Florida.
Right. And speaking of Florida, Stephen, this might be a little too hot take territory for you, but if Anthony Richardson has another poor performance, do you even consider, I don't know what the status of Jack Miller is, but do you consider benching him? Or is this more of a factor of Florida's lacking weapons and all this, but and you kind of just got to ride the guy you got? What's your thoughts on that? Because I heard people kind of clamoring for that even during the Missouri game when he had like 30 passing yards in the first half.
That's a really tough call because I think to your point, the weapons at Florida, the one thing I've heard in talking to people who follow Florida the most, they keep harping on the receivers. And you can see it. I mean, I think there are some questions about the game-breaking ability of the overall group. They just need more playmakers. And, of course, I think you've seen some good things out of Montrell Johnson, ETN as well. I think very, very broadly, this will be a bad answer for you, but it'll be like LSU. And I think you have to show some patience with your guy. He can do the things we saw against Utah and Tennessee. He can also have the games like he did against, South Florida and Missouri. And I think, very broadly, that's what makes this game against LSU interesting is I just have no idea what I'm going to get out of Florida. A lot of that is Anthony Richardson. So I think to your point, I think it's too early to bench him. I think you do want to see that type of performance, and you also want to see more consistency. That was really the big question for me coming into this year. You watch him and you see the talent in previous years, the big plays, but can he put it all together? And I think that's what remains to be seen at this point. And we should also know too, Jack Miller's injury, I think maybe affects the way that you have to use Anthony Richardson this season. You can't deploy him as many times as you want maybe in the running game just because you're worried about him getting hurt. Maybe it's no coincidence that two of his best games came against Utah and Tennessee in games where they maybe used him a little bit more kind of how I would expect.
Right, and in fairness to Richardson, in the second half, he had an incredible touchdown pass on the run, hit Ricky Pershaw in the back of the end zone. So I'm not sitting here saying we got to bench him, but interesting. How about this matchup, Stephen? Mississippi State at Kentucky. Kentucky coming off a brutal loss, of course, without Will Levis. Will Levis, I don't know if you saw this, Stephen, but in the pregame, he was recorded saying he will be back this weekend. Mark Stoops, not willing to go quite that far. Maybe it's some gamesmanship, who knows? But they certainly need a win in the worst possible way, and they're getting one of the worst teams in the SEC to guarantee a win against, because Mississippi State is red hot right now. What's your thoughts on this matchup?
I think a lot of it just depends on if Will Levis plays or not. I think if Kentucky has to go without Will Levis this week, I think Mississippi State wins this game. I mean, Kentucky's won 3 in a row against Mississippi State in Lexington. And of course, we know what happened last year in Starkville. But really, that's what this game to me boils down to, because I think Kentucky's flaws at this point of the year are pretty obvious. The offensive line, the issues they had against South Carolina could show up again against Mississippi State. I think they will need to run the ball, obviously, to keep Will Rogers off the field. So without Levis, it's already going to be a very difficult matchup because Mississippi State is just red hot right now, like you mentioned. I mean, 18 points plus victories over Arkansas and A&M. So that beating teams by double digits in the SEC is really impressive. Rogers has been, I think, 12 touchdown passes in his last 3 games, too. So this is already a tough assignment. If Levis doesn't play, it's going to be even tougher for Kentucky. And, Mississippi State's favored by 7. I don't know whether we should read anything into that as to what the odds makers think. But if I'm looking at that spread, it tells me that Levis Vegas thinks that it's more iffy that he's, in the lineup as opposed to for sure being in.
Right. And let me ask you more about Kentucky, Stephen, because, I had a guest on this show famously said Kentucky sucks. This was before, this was against Ole Miss. And then we're seeing some of those comments from respected people, not that they suck, but just, this was, far, far from a top 10 team. I mean, they were struggling. They struggled almost every damn game they've played, Stephen. And, some of this competition has been severely lacking. Now they're getting the wins, or at least they were. They could have very well beat Ole Miss on the road. Let's not forget that. They did beat Florida on the road. So this is a very tough team. I'm not saying they're soft like some people, but, the offensive line, obviously a huge issue. And even if Levis does play, Stephen, I mean, this is what I was scared to death of all season. They're getting sacked and sacked and sacked. And now he's banged up, it's a disaster if he keeps getting hit. Now, I know they got Chris Rodriguez. He's running like a machine back there, but that's about all they had against South Carolina. And without Will Levis, it was just, the entire foundation came crumbling down. They looked just awful to me, Stephen. They look like one of the worst teams in the SEC, at least on offense, without Will Levis. So I don't know, was Will Levis propping this thing up, or do you think that, they just had an awful game against South Carolina?
I think it could be a little bit of both. Like, I think Will Levis is just that valuable to the team, and even more so valuable this year considering the offensive line questions, just because they can't lean on what they normally do with Rodriguez. I will say, I think sometimes in terms of style of play, like Kentucky's style of play cannot be like the most aesthetically pleasing. And I mean that like in a good way. Like they just find ways to win. They play good defense. Normally the offensive line and running game, they get that going. They can set up with what Levis was doing last year. So I think that just this year, the offensive line, when you lose three studs like that, at some point, it's just you're going to get a drop off. And we've seen that this year in the first part of the season. I think what I'm looking for is, we've reached the midpoint of the season. The rest of the way, can they start to get some improvement? Because if they can, they have an off week after playing Mississippi State. They still have to play Georgia. They still get the rivalry game against Louisville. Still have to play Tennessee. So there are some opportunities to get some marquee wins. But coming into this year, I thought they were somewhere 8-4, maybe at the high end of things, 9-3. I don't think that they'll get to 9-3, but if they can get Levis back and get him in the lineup, that certainly just makes kind of the whole operation work. So I think it might be a little bit of both, like just a bad game for Kentucky, and also they just really miss Will Levis at this point. If the line doesn't get any better, it's hard to see them being able to even threaten, Georgia or Tennessee at this point.
I just know if I was a Kentucky fan, Steven, I'd be sick to my stomach. We finally got a quarterback that we can rely on. We got the best receiving core maybe ever in school history. And then what are we known for? Offensive line. Now that's an issue. It's like, come on, man. Like, come on. But let me ask you about Mississippi State, Steven. How impressed are you with Mike Leach and this offensive line, this running game, the commitment to the running game? Because this is what Arkansas did on defense that was totally ineffective. The drop 8, 3-man rush, that was just devastating to Mike Leach's offense for 2 years in a row in the SEC. He's finally willing and able to go to the ground game, and they'll pulverize you on the ground, which just opens things up for Will Rogers and this receiving core. And that makes Mississippi State more dangerous than ever, in my opinion.
Yeah, it really does. One of the stats that stood out to me from that Mississippi State game on Saturday was the 0 sacks that they gave up to Arkansas. I thought for sure going into that game, Arkansas would be able to get some pressure on the quarterback maybe a couple times, even without KJ Jefferson. Maybe the defense would win a few battles. They only had 5 quarterback pressures by Pro Football Focus. I mean, the offensive line for Mississippi State against A&M and against Arkansas did what it needed to do. You mentioned the running game too. I mean, it's not that much, they're not running it like drastically different in terms of carries or anything like that, but they're basically averaging about another yard more per carry this season, and they're running it just enough more to kind of give a little bit more balance. So the offensive line, if it plays like that, going to Kentucky, a good defense this week, if they can get the protection that they've had the last couple of weeks, I mean, that just spells good things for Mississippi State to keep the offense rolling like it has the last 2 games.
Now, how about this matchup, Steven? Auburn at Ole Miss. If I'm not mistaken, Auburn beat Ole Miss last season. Bo Nix had a heroic performance. I think Ole Miss beat everybody but the state of Alabama last year. So thoughts on this matchup? Very different rosters, very different teams. Ole Miss a big favorite at home. How do you handicap this one?
I think from looking at the history, I think it's Auburn's won the last 6 in this series with Ole Miss. So, it's been one-sided. It probably will change this Saturday, but based upon what we've seen so far this year. I mean, Auburn has scored 17 or fewer points in its last 4 games against Power 5 opponents. And, we saw on Saturday it was Georgia, but, they had the one big pass play to the running back. There's just not enough kind of, production out of the quarterback, the passing game. They need more game breakers at receiver. Auburn can certainly run it with Tank Bigsby, although it seems like at times they just forget that he's existing this year and going away from him. But Auburn's going to need to score, I mean, just more than 17 points to win this game. Ole Miss is a 14-point favorite coming off of what Jackson Dart did last week. I like the way that Ole Miss responded after falling behind. I mean, the defense gave up a lot early, but I think they gave up only 1 scoring drive out of Vanderbilt's last 7 drives. So the defense stepped up. And then after that, we saw what the offense could do with Jackson Dart. And of course, we know they can run the ball too. So this just looks like a very difficult matchup for Auburn based upon the way they've played offensively and Ole Miss's firepower, plus the way they're playing on defense right now.
Well, because this is Auburn and Ole Miss we're discussing here, Stephen, I got to ask the question. Would you either hire or think it's a good idea for Auburn to hire old Hugh Freeze? I don't know if he's ever DM'd you like he has so many of us others. You're not one to get critical on Twitter like I am, so I assume he has not, but maybe he's grown up a little. Do you think Auburn should explore that option?
I think so. I mean, I think the question, I think, with the Auburn coaching search is going to be, the candidates that are out there. And I think if you make a list of names, it's probably Deion Sanders, Jamie Chadwell, Coastal Carolina, Matt Rhule, and probably Hugh Freeze as well would probably be some of the names thrown around. I think you will see a coach probably hired with SEC experience at Auburn this time. And I think the question is also going to be alignment. That was the question with some of the other coaches in previous searches. If you're Auburn, you're going to need to prove to some of these other guys, whether it's a Chadwell, whether it's a Matt Rhule, that everybody's on the same page, top to bottom, AD, whatever it is. I think Freeze's experience in the SEC and with Ole Miss, the offense that he runs, obviously recruiting, he gets it in the SEC. I think it makes a lot of sense for Auburn to go that route if that's what they do.
Now, last week, they just ended up blasting Vanderbilt, but they were down at halftime. Ole Miss, of course, I'm talking about here. Jackson Dart had a couple really bad interceptions. Those were the negatives. But on the positive, like I said, they just completely obliterated them in the second half, literally set records for receiving yards for Jonathan Mingo. Jackson Dart, he was not even in the top 10 in SEC passing. Now he's like number 5, just based on the one game he had against Vanderbilt. What's your biggest takeaway from that performance? The negatives and the issues in the first half, or maybe a case of them being like, all right, we got to get up for this one, and then there's just obliterating them?
Yeah, I was curious how Ole Miss would respond because of the game against Kentucky. And then you had to turn around and play Vanderbilt, who had 2 weeks to prepare for this game. So I'm not totally surprised that Vanderbilt pushed them. In fact, I thought Vanderbilt would cover the spread. That late touchdown was sort of heartbreaking if you picked Vanderbilt to cover the spread. But I think we've talked about Ole Miss, and it really feels like they're a team that has all these talented puzzle pieces on the board. And the question would be how they all fit together, and not knowing the culture and the transfers, how it all would come together. And I think each time we've watched them, the defense stepped up when it mattered against Kentucky. And when it mattered against Vanderbilt, they were able to get that offense going. You mentioned the big plays. I mean, I think they had 3 passing touchdowns of 60-plus yards in that game. It is Vanderbilt's defense. It was one of the worst defenses in the SEC last year, still early in the year, but I think it'll probably end up somewhere again this year at the bottom of the league. So I want to see them do that against one of Auburn this week, or even some of the other teams in the West going forward. But I think if you're an Ole Miss fan, I think you have to like the fact that, Dart has made fewer than, I think, 10 starts in his career. He's getting more comfortable. He looks more comfortable in the offense. And if that's the type of production they can get every week, I mean, they're going to hit double-digit wins probably by the end of the year.
Well, speaking of Vanderbilt, they go on the road to Georgia this weekend. Mighty Georgia, made quick work of Auburn. Nice bounce-back performance. And this was even with apparently Stetson Bennett a little banged up. But, clearly this is not going to be a ball game. But last season, I mean, it was dreadful, Stephen. I'm sure you remember, but it was like a sea of red there in Vanderbilt Stadium. It was Georgia celebrating down on Broadway all weekend long. They made a vacation. It was like a mini bowl in the middle of the season. It may not be as bad this year because Vanderbilt has improved, but Georgia, no drop off. So I don't know what do you make of this matchup, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, it's tough to make a case for Vanderbilt to make this game competitive. I think there are a couple things. I like the way AJ Swann's playing. I mean, he started a game against Northern Illinois. Was kind of surprised that he started over Mike Wright, and he had to face Alabama. But I think you've seen the progression that you want. He doesn't look overwhelmed by the moment of playing in the SEC and playing Ole Miss last week. I think go on the road and see what happens against Georgia. I think I'm just curious about Vanderbilt from a growth perspective. I feel like they're going to be a little bit more competitive in the SEC this year. I don't think it's probably going to happen at Georgia. It's going to be those games against Ole Miss. It's going to be the games against the other teams, Missouri, South Carolina, Florida from the SEC. So I think I want to see just how they handle the moment. I think for Georgia, we talked about Stetson Bennett. You look at his yards per attempt the last 3 weeks, they've gone from 7.6 to 7.3 to 6.5 in the last 3 games and no touchdowns in that span. So is there something to the injury? Is there something to injury to him, injury to receivers, the way defenses have played him? I think it's probably a combination of all the above. Vanderbilt should be a good kind of get well moment for this team. I like the way they ran the ball last week too, almost 300 yards against Auburn. So it's a pretty monumental task, I think, for Vanderbilt to keep this close. And this is probably one of those games where Georgia can empty the bench kind of games and get some other guys in there.
Right. And for Georgia, I wanted to ask you this, Stephen. Do you think maybe not you necessarily, but maybe this show, a little too harsh on Georgia for, maybe some games it looks like they're lacking weapons outside of these all-world tight ends they got. In other games, it looks like they're getting controlled at the line of scrimmage or they struggle to run the ball. Now the passing production is not there. Is this just a case of this the national champions, and heck, they're still bludgeoning most people they play, but there are little flaws in their game? Do you think we're being too harsh on Georgia? I mean, nothing you've seen has convinced you that they can't win another national championship, is there?
Right. I think that's it. I think that's the standard you have to judge Georgia on, because you're also judging them against Alabama and you're also judging them against Ohio State. And if they want to win the national championship again, which I think they can do, those are the flaws that are going to show up. It's like when you talk about Alabama's flaws, it's also sort of relative. Like they're number 1 or number 2. Can it catch up to them in a game? And we've talked earlier, I think Tennessee can beat Alabama and Georgia both on its schedule. I mean, if Georgia plays like they did against Kent State and Missouri, they're very beatable. And so Tennessee could do that. So I think the injuries at receiver are still something that I want to see what happens when Georgia can get the full arsenal back. I mean, they beat Oregon by over 40 points in the season opener, and Oregon's right on the verge of being a top 10 team this year. So some of that for Georgia could just be, it's kind of a national title hangover. You have a lot of new faces. You're working through some things. I mean, if they get back to that level like they played against Oregon, they're going to be fine. But I think picking apart some of these things, that could catch up to them against Alabama for sure.
How impressed are you with their defense, though? Because I think we all assumed they take a step back, not a major one, but a slight one. And really, I mean, they're, maybe it's in part not the Oregon, not the trip to South Carolina, but the last couple of weeks, the competition they played. But man, they're, at least on paper, they're basically as elite as they were last season.
For sure. Yeah. It's one of those things where I think Georgia just basically, they lost a ton of talent, but they have the next wave of superstars ready to emerge. And we've seen that this year with some of the guys they have at linebacker, not to mention Starks at safety's made a couple plays this year. Scary thing too, Jalen Carter being banged up. Like when they get him back and they get some of these guys more experience in the SEC, they can only get back to being close to that group last year. There's no way they can match that group's like dominance from week to week, but still, I mean, you lose all those guys and then to replace them. And then by the end of the year, they're still going to be probably top 5 in nationally in scoring defense. I mean, that's a pretty big accomplishment considering who they lost.
And do you think there's anything to this, Stephen, that maybe they came out so red hot, they look like, oh my God, they're far and away the best team once again. They're littered. They do have experience across the board, but also they're playing a lot of young players, replacing a lot of leaders from last season's team. Not that this team's lacking leadership or anything, but anything to maybe them, I don't want to say reading the press clippings, but maybe thinking they had arrived when there's still the vast majority of the schedule to go. They're catching everybody's best shot, and that's going to be the case every game because they're the defending national champions. And maybe just getting caught up in the hype a little bit. Do you think there could be anything to that, to why they've, again, we're grading them on a curve, but the last couple weeks have just been a little disappointing?
Oh, for sure. I use the same. I'll use the same example that you and I kind of talked about, I think, a few weeks ago when Florida State won the national title, and they were basically penciled in to repeat in 2014, the first year of the college football playoff. They lost some guys to the NFL, had some close calls, but still won. And you kind of thought, well, if they just put everything together by the playoff, they're going to be just fine. And they get smoked by Oregon in the Rose Bowl. I don't think Georgia's going to meet that same fate. I think they're going to get this together, barring some sort of injury or just major complacency. I think it's easy to settle in. I mean, they pounded Oregon in the season opener, and I think it's a week to week battle coming off a national championship of trying to keep everything moving in the right direction. If you're Kirby Smart, especially when you're favored by 20 points or so almost every week. So I'll buy some of that for sure. And I think looking ahead, what's interesting for Georgia, they get Florida, Tennessee, at Mississippi State, and then at Kentucky. So those 4 games after Vanderbilt, after the off week, will tell us a lot about where this team is. And we'll see if they can flip the switch back to week dominance, because they'll need it in those 4 games.
All right, Stephen, the game of the week in the SEC, game of the week in the country, in my opinion, the third Saturday in October. Both these teams undefeated, Stephen. I think I heard the stat first time since like 1989. Both these teams entered this matchup undefeated. Alabama at Tennessee. What's your early read on this ball game?
I think the first thing isn't it great that the third Saturday in October actually means something for the first time in like forever? I mean, it's like it's so long for these two teams to meet as ranked teams. I think it's like one time since 06 where they both of these teams were ranked. And so I think just it's great for the SEC. It's great for college football to have some of these big time rivalries mean something. There are several elements to this game that are just fascinating. I think, first of all, Bryce Young status. Is he 100%? Is he 85%? What level of effectiveness will he be at on Saturday? Because I think Alabama needs him in the lineup to win this game. I think questions for Tennessee's defense. I think how are they going to, from the secondary standpoint, if Bryce Young's 100%, the playmakers that Alabama brings to the table, I think it'll be a challenge for Tennessee unless they are able to get the pressure that they did against LSU. And also, this is one of the best offenses in college football against one of maybe the best defense in Alabama. So I'm just interested in the chess match between Hendon Hooker, maybe getting something out of Cedric Tillman and those receivers against Alabama. And you got Will Anderson on the other side too. So, game of the week, it might be the game of the month in the SEC just because the stakes are so high on Saturday.
Yeah, and something we were talking about off air before we started recording, but Alabama, they're like I call them the Terminator, because they just keep coming at you and you have got to kill them. They're not going to beat themselves ever. But they nearly did against A&M. Multiple 4 turnovers, missed field goals. I don't want to say they handed that thing to A&M because, that was a tough, hard-fought game. But, what does that say about Alabama, Stephen, that they can overcome all these mistakes and still beat A&M? Say what you want about them. They still got a top 10 overall roster in college football. What does that say about Alabama that they can win those games?
I think it's a good thing, to kind of put it mildly. Like, all those things were stacked up against Alabama. They gave A&M a lot of short fields, and I think it shows that without your best player, you had to just find a way to win. Sometimes in college football, so much of it is you just have to survive from week to week, and you have to get there to the end of the year. And sometimes you have to win a game like that where you're shorthanded. And Alabama did. I thought Alabama's defense played fine. They gave up some plays. There was, the crazy catch by Stewart on the sidelines on that last drive. And certainly, Stewart and some of the other receivers made some nice plays. But, watching that game for the most part, I never really felt like A&M was going to be able to win that game until that last drive. I thought, oh, they actually have a chance to do it. But you also saw the depth and the ways that Alabama can beat you. They can beat you with defense. They can beat you with a running game. Milroe did just enough, despite the turnovers, to win. So Alabama has, I think, some flaws, but I also think that wins like that show the depth and the talent on the roster. And it's also the difference sometimes between Alabama and some of these other teams. They just find ways to win, and the depth on the roster eventually adds up somewhere during the year.
So do you think, I mean, you kind of alluded to it, but if Jalen Milroe is the only quarterback that, well, not the only one, but, no Bryce Young essentially, or if he's just, a shell of himself, do you think they can outscore Tennessee? Do you think, basically, I guess I'm basically asking you, if Bryce Young don't play, is Tennessee going to win it?
I think Tennessee can win this game either way. I'm not trying to give any false hope to Tennessee fans. So, but I do think they can win this game. And I think the fact that it is in Knoxville is a big reason why. We've seen over the last 2 years, Alabama's been inconsistent on the road. They had a better performance against Arkansas going. Then they lost Bryce Young. Arkansas came back. So there's so many factors that just make it really hard to read. I think if Alabama doesn't have Bryce Young, I think it's a real problem. I think Milroe can play better for sure. If he doesn't make those mistakes, I think the game is a little bit more one-sided on Saturday in favor of Alabama. But I think when you start looking at matchups, I love the way Jahmyr Gibbs has played the last couple games. Big game against Arkansas, huge on Saturday against Texas A&M against a good defense. I think he's going to be getting the ball in space a lot on Saturday. So I think Alabama can find some different ways to generate points. The defense is good enough to hold serve on the road. But man, if Bryce Young doesn't play, suddenly I think Tennessee's odds get a lot better on Saturday.
How do you think Tennessee matches up, though, on the line of scrimmage? Because I think that is a area of the game a lot of people overlook. And Tennessee's on both sides has exceeded my expectations up to this point, but they're going up against a different animal here in the Alabama Crimson Tide. Does Alabama, in your mind, have a major advantage on the line of scrimmage?
It's a good question. Major might be a little strong, but I think Alabama definitely has an edge there. Will Anderson was charted, depending on where you look, with either 8 or 11 quarterback hurries on Saturday night. I mean, he lived in the A&M backfield. And then you add in Dallas Turner and you add some of the other guys that they have. I think that's the problem that Tennessee's going to have to navigate. This is the best pass rush that they've played. Pitt gave them some trouble earlier in the year. Alabama's even better than that, and they can do it different ways. And then I think on the other side of the ball, Alabama's offensive line is up to first in Pro Football Focus's pass blocking metrics. We've seen what they've been able to do the last couple weeks on the ground. So I think Alabama's offensive line might be rounding into form a little bit. But I think if you're Tennessee, you can counter and say, hey, look, our group just went to Baton Rouge and they dominated with the 5 sacks and keeping LSU's ground game in check. Some of that is LSU's offensive line is pretty shaky at this point of the year, but Tennessee might be trending up on defense, and that would give me some optimism if I'm Tennessee for sure.
Now, usually, Stephen, when you lose a preseason All-American, that's cause for huge concern. But at Tennessee, when Cedric Tillman went down, what that resulted in seemingly is Brew McCoy and Jalen Hyatt elevating their game. And I know it'd be unfair, I think, for Tillman to ask him to come back in and be his old self right away. But how impressed have you been with McCoy and Hyatt, their ability to elevate their game? And now, once Tillman is back to or close to full strength, I mean, Tennessee may have the best receiving core, maybe even in the country.
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely a receiving core that's probably top 5 in the country with Cedric Tillman. And if he's 100%, it ranks even higher. I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Jalen Milroe, is that Tennessee's depth at receiver allowed them to navigate some of these games without Cedric Tillman. If you didn't have Brew McCoy, if you didn't have Jalen Hyatt, Ramel Keaton's made some clutch catches too, but at the same time, the depth of receivers and playmakers has allowed Tennessee to keep that offense going. So I really like what Tennessee has done at receiver. I think this group will give them some challenge, will give Alabama a challenge on Saturday. A&M was able to move the ball with their playmakers. I think this Tennessee group is just as good, if not better. We also saw that Texas, when Quinn Ewers was in the game, was able to take some shots downfield. So these one-on-one matchups, Tennessee receivers will have to win them on Saturday, and I think they can definitely do that.
All right, final thing I got on this game, Steven. Do you think that Hendon Hooker can win the Heisman essentially on Saturday with an epic performance, or will it be a little too? I mean, provided Tennessee doesn't have a collapse or anything, but this is going to be his Heisman opportunity, I would think, unless maybe even if he does have a great game and Georgia dismantles him, maybe it'd be hard for him to win it then. But do you think he could essentially be the lead? He may already be the leader, but kind of cement himself as the favorite for the rest of the season on Saturday?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think depending on where you look, he's like first or second. I think CJ Stroud of Ohio State is the other candidate that's either first or second in most Heisman straw polls. Big performance against the number one defense. If he goes out and throws for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns or so, and Tennessee wins, and he makes Alabama's defense, look very vulnerable. Absolutely. I think you would see him, even if he's first in some of those polls, he would gap everyone else. So it is a Heisman moment, but it's also, I don't know that he can necessarily win the trophy here. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years, Bryce Young basically won it in the SEC championship game with the big performance that he had. Devonta Smith came on strong in November to put himself in a position to win the award. There's still a lot of games to be played. I mean, we're basically at the midpoint of the season. So I think a big performance gets him at the top, but I also think we'll see how he navigates the rest of the schedule. But I mean, at this point, I would say it would take a lot for him to fall out of the top 5 or top 10 or so of the Heisman by the end of the year if he keeps performing at this pace.
Now, we do have 3 teams on a bye this weekend, Stephen, in the SEC: Texas A&M, South Carolina, and Missouri. So I just wanted to ask your quick thoughts. If I don't ask you about a team, I hear about it all the rest of the week. But so we got to serve those fans, Stephen. But interestingly, A&M and South Carolina, they got the bye week, and then they face off in Columbia. So let's start with A&M. Kind of keys to the bye week in your mind, and what do they got to get corrected to make sure that on the second half of the schedule here they exceed expectations?
I think it's kind of it's basic to say it, but I think that they need to continue to show growth on offense. Like, if you could get that type of performance you saw against Alabama, obviously it wasn't perfect, and Alabama gave them some short fields, but get the ball to those guys in space. Evan Stewart, Muhammad, like, they have some dudes downfield that I would want to be throwing the ball more to. It's sort of the same thing that we've talked about A&M all season. They just need to make significant strides on offense. I also at some point would like to see Connor Wigman at quarterback. I think we know the kind of quarterback that Haynes King is, and you're approaching that point of the season where you can play him and still preserve the red shirt. So at some point I would like to see him. So I think for A&M, the bye week is vital because you have so many young players and you can sort of reset for the second half. So I think you want to see those guys continue to develop, but also long-term, offensive line, quarterback, the 2 positions that'll sort of probably make or break whether or not this team ends up, 7-5 or so, or finishes a lot closer to 6-6 and struggles to get bowl eligible.
Yeah, and I do think one thing about A&M, Stephen, that in that Alabama game, so many of those young players stepped up and made plays in the toughest game they're going to have this entire season. That bodes very, very well for the rest of the season for them if they continue to progress, continue to make those plays. I mean, there's no reason that A&M, if they live up to expectations, I'm not saying they're going to beat everybody on their schedule, but they should stand, a good odds of beating most teams than not, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at their schedule coming up, they get South Carolina on the road after the bye week, and then Ole Miss, Florida, at Auburn, UMass, and LSU. And most of those games come at home. So the schedule really breaks in their favor, and the timing of this bye week could really be crucial because you can get, kind of everyone reset for the second half. And I think to your point on the young players, that's been kind of the one thing I keep going back to with A&M. And you try to be measured about where they are this season. They obviously have some things offensively long-term that they have to sort out, but they just pushed the number 1, 2, or 3 team in the country in Alabama. They beat them last year. if you can figure some of these things out, roster talent long term is not a problem. And of course, we know they'll have a good class this year. So I know A&M has kind of been beat up this year, but there's a lot to be optimistic about going forward if they can fix some of these things on offense. We know the defense will eventually be back at the top of the SEC once again. So they've taken some hits, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about long term with the talent on the roster for sure.
Yeah, and so South Carolina, I mean, they may have just saved their season, Stephen. I mean, they still got a gauntlet remaining, but they go into the bye 4-2, which some of these fans were 3 weeks ago ready to fire the entire staff. I'm kind of kidding, but they were down. You'll lose a couple games early, you get down on your program, but they have bounced back terrifically. No one's in Columbia is going to shed any tears for Will Levis in Kentucky that he wasn't there because they've been down a number of key players all season there in Columbia. So do you think that win on the road against Kentucky, a team they have struggled to beat in the last 8 years, do you think that can kind of spurn them to a big second half of the season? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think so. I think to your point, they saved, the potential for a bowl game because it really felt like they had to pick off an upset or two to at least guarantee like 6 victories. I mean, it's not going to necessarily be easy because they still have to play Missouri. They still, of course, have to play Vanderbilt and A&M to try to get to that 6-7 win type of season. But, they needed to get an upset, and they did. They took advantage of a very winnable game with Levis missing for Kentucky. I love the fact that Shane Beamer had the glasses and the music ready to go once they won that game, man. That was high quality trolling on his part. So kudos to Shane Beamer. But, when I look at that schedule for South Carolina, I see 3 very winnable games coming up. You have an A&M team that's struggling on offense. You've got Missouri's winnable, Vanderbilt's winnable. If you can sweep those games, you're sitting there at 7-2. If you win 2 out of 3, you're 6-2, and you set yourself up for a bowl game. So there's still a lot roster wise, that I want to see development from offensively and defensively. But if they can win 2 out of these next 3, they're going to be in good shape to get to obviously 6-6, and maybe they can pull off an upset once they get to November 2 and get to 7-5.
Yeah, I'm glad you referenced that, Stevie, because I suggested that they could be 7-2. I'm not predicting it. Hell, A&M, I don't believe they've ever beaten A&M since they joined the SEC, so that ain't a layup. Missouri keeps improving, but what's your thoughts on the offense and how that's coming together? Still, struggling. I thought at the halftime of the Kentucky game might be time to fire everybody. Just how poor they were doing in the first half. But hey, credit this staff. They made the adjustments. They got a big time win, thanks in large part to that offense. Are you still concerned at all on the offensive side of the ball, or you kind of want to evaluate it at the end of the season?
I feel like I've given you like a bad, like mild middle of the road answer on some of these. So, but I do think at the end of the year, we'll have a much better sense of where Marcus Satterfield's offense, which I know that's a very testy subject among South Carolina fans, and where it is at the end of the year. But, when you're trying to blend all these transfers at receiver and quarterback, it does take some time to get everybody on the same page. You have a relatively new staff too. So I think there is a wait and see element, but by the end of the year, you have 2 seasons of data points. And if the offense is still start, stop, kind of sputtering, and when I watch it sometimes, I just see an offense that just kind of lacks like continuity and flow sometimes. So at the end of the year, if the offense is still performing like it has, then I think maybe you look at some changes. I think one of the reasons that I think you have to like where this group, played on Saturday and some of the growth maybe is Marshawn Lloyd. His last 3 games have given the offense a little bit different dimension. They needed some balance. They can't just rely on Spencer Rattler to throw it 45 times a game, giving some of the questions along the offensive line. So I think if I'm South Carolina, I like what I saw at times. I just want to see more of it in the next 3 games, which could be really make or break for their season.
Now, finally, Missouri, man, coming off some tough losses here, Stephen, in back-to-back fashion. I don't know if you're a big fan of trivia, Steven, but I do refer to you as the college football encyclopedia. Do you have any idea when the last time Missouri lost 3 consecutive games by 7 points or less?
I don't. I feel like an idiot. I should know this, man. But
1955. I heard that today and I was like, my word. I mean, that just gives you an idea of just what a freak stretch Missouri has been on here. No need to rehash it for those poor fans, but man, they're so close. I mean, that what you read on this team going into the bye, because they desperately need to flip some of these games to make the postseason. They're falling just short. Does that give you a reason for optimism on the back half, or do you think this team, may crumble? What's your read on that?
yeah, I think I hate to start with this, and I hate to go back to it, but man, that, like you said, that is just like so brutal of a 3-game stretch. And I think looking down the road, I think some of the things that we've seen in those games, if they're not, they need more of a big play element on offense. And they outgained Florida, 370 to 297, and lost largely due they had a pick 6 and they had another interception too. So, I think some of those things like turnovers, generating more big plays on offense is a must. They need Brady Cook to be a little bit more consistent too. I think optimistically, I think Missouri's defense has probably been better than I thought it was going to be. I mean, I know they turned things around late last year, but with all the transfers and coordinator change, wasn't really sure what to expect out of this group. But watching them, they look like a better group, and the stats bear that out through the first half of the season. So I think if you can get a little bit more of the offense, that helps get you over the hump in some of those close games. They are probably going to need an upset to probably get bowl eligible, and I think that's where if we're looking at Missouri going forward, if they can get a little bit more of the offense, that might mean the difference between 5-7 and 6-6, especially after the stretch we just saw.
And just based on what you've seen this season from them, Steven, this season, do you think they have it in them to pull that upset?
Man, I was looking at their schedule just now as we're talking. They have to go to South Carolina and to Tennessee and Arkansas. So like those were the Arkansas is at home. Those are the games you'd probably circle as upset potential. Maybe they can get South Carolina if South Carolina's offense is still, playing like we've talked about. But, maybe Kentucky at home on November 5th. We'll see what Kentucky looks like the next couple of weeks too. I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, they've been so close and knocking on the door of an upset. It seems like they're going to get somebody at some point this year. So I guess I'll take the yes. That Missouri will pick off somebody at some point this season.
All right, ended it on a high note. I really appreciate you, Steven, stopping by as always. Before you go, tell the folks where's the best place to find all your work.
Absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Athlon Steven. You can also check out my work at athlonsports.com. We also have the Twitter space on Mondays at 11 a.m. Eastern time. You can stop by. You can ask questions if you want to. Come talk some SEC stuff. And be sure to check out my YouTube page at All CFB 365.
All right. So, hey, just want to say thanks again for everybody tuning into the show. Thanks, Steven, for joining me. We were able once again to hit on all SEC teams. We did successfully manage to hit on all 14 SEC teams this time around, so I hope everyone appreciated that. That's what we try to do on this show, and I hope that's reflected in the content. We got a wild weekend upcoming here in the SEC, so stay tuned. We're going to have more great content all week long heading in to the weekend action, but that is going to do it for this episode of the show. We'll catch you on the next one.